Yes.
Well, good evening. It's good to see you all connecting in. We'll just leave it a couple of minutes while everyone joins up, unless they're still on the telephone trying to get their Eurovision tickets. Well, no such problem here. We have unlimited available places. So it's good to see you from all around the world. I recognize various names, which is great to see. Whether this is your first time or if you're a regular viewer of our lectures, we always appreciate that, especially as we know you come from all around the world, all around the United Kingdom, which is fantastic. We'll just give it a minute or two. So while we're waiting for people to connect in, I'll just, I know you all know this already, but I'll just remind you of a couple of points about how we run this. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment. When you come up with incisive, probing questions, do pop them into the chat box. And then at the end, Rob will pick the most pertinent ones and put them to our speakers. So do feel free to ask questions away, and don't worry. Sometimes the most obvious sounding ones are actually the ones that can create the most stress for our speakers. So don't be put off. Sorry, I'm not saying stress our speakers. What I'm saying is don't be put off by thinking, oh, that may be a really obvious question. So, you know, no question is obvious and that sort of thing. So anyway, well, welcome to the Society of Church Archaeology. It's a pleasure to have you here. I know many of you are members, but if for some strange, unforeseen reason you are not, I just encourage you to think about joining us. It's because of our members we're able to put on these talks for free, and we put them on every month. And, you know, there are lots of other benefits to the Society, including our journal, the latest edition, which has just come out in the last couple of weeks, which is fantastic. And our speakers, when we were chatting beforehand, let slip that they have just submitted a paper to the journal as well. So that will be forthcoming in the not too distant future. So I think I will introduce our speakers. Tonight we actually have a double act. So hopefully if the technology gremlins don't fail, we will get two for the price of one, which, given we're not paying them, doesn't make much difference. But we have our first speaker in no particular order, apart from alphabetical, is Brian Costello, who is a teaching fellow at the School of Archaeology and Ancient History at the University of Leicester. But he's formerly of the parish of Chester, where he did his PhD, which I literally was reading 2 weeks ago. Oh, yes, I was, genuinely, sir. On early medieval funerary rituals, and particularly the inclusion of Roman material and other things within them. And he is joined by a face that may be familiar to some of you, because he gave us a talk about 6 or 9 months ago, I can't remember, on the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury. And it's John Jenkins, who is the Assistant Director of the Centre of Pilgrimage Studies at the University of York. And tonight they're going to be talking to us about the Preceptory at Slebech. I don't know, we had a discussion how you pronounce it. So if there are any people from Pembroke here, do correct our pronunciation. And it's in the context of rethinking social function and burial practices. So I will hand over to John, who's going to start talking. Presentation.
And there will be a couple pictures of skeletal remains, just to let everybody know as well. So just give me a second here. All right, John, ready to go?
Thank you. Yes. Well, you can put it on the next one, because that's, isn't it?
Yep. There we go.
Lovely. Cheers. There's going to be a lot of that, I think. So thank you for having us. It's always a real pleasure to talk to the Society. I say this is a double-hander. Brian and I have. This has come out of a residency scheme at a project that some of you may be familiar with, the UKRI Future Leaders project at the University of Liverpool called The Human Remains. You can see the title there, Digital Library of British Mortuary Science, with Ruth Nugent as the leader, the PI on that. And it's a fabulous project. They do go to their website and read all about it if you haven't already. Part of this was also that there are residencies, which Brian and I were invited to, where you're looking at particular case studies to do with, broadly speaking, the treatment of human remains in Britain between the 7th and 19th centuries, but a case study which could be focused on how the information from that could be used with public engagement, with education, with conservation, with changes in mortuary practice. And so this idea of this being particularly focused, but also useful externally, as it were. And so we bashed our heads together quite a bit and came up with this idea. If Brian's an archaeologist, I'm very much a documentary historian. We dabble in each other's fields, but that's our background. So it is very interdisciplinary, this. And we eventually, after sliding around for a few things, came together with this idea on a focus on the Knights Hospitallers, particularly in Wales, and the site at Slebech. This move on to the next one now, Brian, but I'll let cheers. I mean, I said that the relevance of this, I think, thinking about hospitallers, I might talk about this more at the end, but the relevance of hospitallers, their functions in care, social function, in traditionally, the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, the St. John's Ambulance has taken on that mantle. Thinking about this as sort of immediately post-pandemic world, the relevance of this generally, and the importance of this, I think, seep through from the start. So the Hospitaller Commandery of Slebech in Pembrokeshire, it was one of the wealthiest houses of the Hospitallers in Britain. It was the third wealthiest monastic house in Wales by the end of the medieval period. It was the second most important Hospitaller site in England and Wales after Clerkenwell, second most important probably in the British Isles. And it serves as this administrative centre for a large collection of lands and churches given to the Hospitallers from the 12th century onwards in South and West Wales, as well as being a bridgehead and a base linking England through South Wales to Ireland, where there were also very important Hospitaller properties. Slebech was founded in the mid-12th century. It attracted grants from Norman Flemish lords of the area, also from native Welsh princes. And in a sense, that's normally how it's been viewed. Slebech, there's a couple of interesting things about Slebech. One is how it gets all this land, which has been studied quite heavily. One is that it has sort of pilgrimage aspect to it, which also has received a little bit of study. And the other is that there's a possible community of women there, of female religious, that we're going to look at as well. So the paper approaches the topic of this because this came from the Human Remains Project, thinking of there's sort of a bleak angle, who we might and who we might not expect to be buried there. There's been no archaeological excavation of Slebech. There's very little surviving remains that are identifiable in any great detail. I'll talk about them in a little bit. But despite, or I would say because of the lack of archaeological data from Slebech, we thought we'd approach this idea of who was buried at Hospitaller houses in later Middle Ages through an idea of how the house fitted into the life cycle, and thus the death element, the end of the life cycle of increasing circles of communities. So firstly, the community that would be resident at the house. Secondly, the local community of gentry who patronised the house and were in a patronage relationship with them. And thirdly, a more itinerant community, which are often associated with Hospitaller burials of pilgrims and felons, criminals. Yeah, so that's the general outline of what we're going to talk about. We're going with the later Middle Ages because often these, when all you've got is a cartulary to go on, as it feels. Often that means you really focus on the 12th and 13th centuries. And a lot of the work on Slebech, not all of it, but a lot of the work on it has been 12th, 13th century. So we're really looking in the 14th and 15th centuries. Unless at the administration of estates is a normal thing here. The evidence is pretty thin, but it is there, and we'll be going through it. But there is documentary evidence, and there is a small amount of architectural archaeological evidence, with the exception of the Preceptory Church. The medieval preceptory and precinct have almost entirely disappeared between the houses and gardens of an 18th, 19th century mansion of Slebech, which is now a hotel and conference centre. The church, which as you can see there from above and from inside, a small single-aisled cruciform building with tower, it bounded on the east and south by the River Cleddau, and while the church as it stands looks to be mostly 14th century, it was in existence as the parish church of Slebech, the village of Slebech, before being granted to the Hospitallers. So the church was appropriated by the Hospitallers, but retained its parish function as well, and was worth £8 a year in 1338, served by a chaplain who was resident of the house and paid slightly more than the Hospitallers paid their other chaplains. This sort of conjunction of parish church and preceptory is it's unusual, but it's not unknown. You do find it at other Hospitaller sites. And so this dual, just coming straight off the bat, this dual parochial Hospitaller function, which previous studies of Slebech haven't really noticed that that's the case with this church, but that would have a strong influence on who's getting buried here, because we actually think mostly parishioners. After the dissolution, Slebech continued as the parochial church and underwent a lot of repairs in the 17th and 18th centuries. Although most of the remaining fabric looks medieval, it was decommissioned in 1840, and a new parish church built further inland, which was then subsequently decommissioned in 1990 as it sort of fell in, had landslip under it. And some of the funerary monuments that we're going to discuss that were in this church were moved to the new church and have now been moved to museums. So that has a relevance for what's coming up. Also of importance to the discussion, you can't see it here, but we've got a collection of ruins just to the south over the River Cleddau, connected to the main house possibly by a ferry or causeway, known in the later Middle Ages as the Sisters' House. And I'll be talking about that subsequently, but these have been the subject of some analysis, and those are the only remains. But apart from that, there's been no archaeological dig here.
So the service of burial by the order of Hospitallers was historically known key undertaken, given special privileges by the papacy, not held by other sacred institutions during the medieval period. Papal permission was first given to the martial orders to create cemeteries along their chapels for burial of their own brethren, but was later expanded to include the right to bury anyone who contributed to the order. However, the cemeteries of the medieval martial orders of Britain have been neglected archaeologically. There are two main reasons for this. First, most of the studies focus on the architecture in the churches and the buildings. And secondly, only a very small number of burials have been excavated and analyzed from martial order cemeteries of Templars and Hospitallers. The discovery of burials at sites of houses of martial orders has been sporadic and inconsistent, displaying no mortuary pattern visible at other monastic cemeteries because of the very small numbers of excavated burials, preventing much further analysis and interpretation of who was buried there and the precincts within these martial orders. A similar picture prevails in continental Europe as well, with only a handful of excavations undertaken at Hospitaller and Templar cemeteries. Many of these have not been thoroughly analyzed, leaving important osteological data and evidence of social status really unavailable. In most cases, insufficient samples of burials from martial order cemeteries is apparent. This may be caused by low numbers of burials. In fact, it might be a defining feature of these properties or precincts. The excavation of Templar Preceptory at South Witham in Lincolnshire only revealed 3 burials within the vicinity of the chapel. Only 14 individuals were excavated from the former Templar property at Denny Abbey, but even this relatively low number may be due to the fact that the abbey was also in possession by the Benedictines prior to the Templars, and then the nuns of Poor Clares after the dissolution of the order, signifying difficulty in identifying to which sect these burials even belonged. Preceptories of Beverley in Yorkshire and Cressing also had small cemetery excavations, but there was too few numbers to really provide any data for a quantitative study. Other sites have had either no direct archaeological surveys or excavations of the burial grounds, with the continued use of the churches after dissolution and into the modern period, as was the case of Slebech, or the sale of the properties where construction ensued before any archaeological work could be completed. In terms of archaeological investigation, Slebech's function throughout the medieval period and through to the 19th century as the parish church would make an analysis of the excavation for any particular hospitaller modes of burial an almost impossible task. And as we would expect, the vast majority of burials at the site to be those of parishioners. Furthermore, those parishioners, as tenants of the house, would themselves be confraters or expedores, a term explored we'll talk about later on. Nonetheless, from a documentary and contextual point of view, it's worth considering how the site may have been used in conjunction with its parochial function. Given the small number of excavated burials, some of the context can still reveal clues to whom the burial community was at Slebech and who it included and how it was organized. For example, the Priory at Clerkenwell, who we've mentioned before, the administrative center of the English Hospitallers, reached its height around the 14th, 15th centuries, would be a closer comparison to that of Slebech in comparison to other houses and preceptories and commanderies. Historical records of burials within the Church of Clerkenwell were reserved for the wealthy elite of London and the surrounding area, as well as high-ranking hospitaller preceptors themselves. There were a number of preceptors from other properties in Britain, and given their official positions, were provided privilege to bury within Priory of Clerkenwell rather than their own preceptory. This suggests that the larger, more profitable preceptories of the Hospitallers were likely seen as more socially important within the order as well. And given that many of the preceptors at Slebech later were promoted to the preceptor of Clerkenwell. Furthermore, several excavations displayed a handful of burials surviving around the Church of Clerkenwell within the precinct's grounds. However, only 16 individuals from the inner precinct outside the church walls have been adequately analyzed for further study. 6 other burials were discovered but on the outer precinct, but there was very little skeletal material surviving, so no detailed analysis was undertaken. These burials in the inner precinct took place between 1330 and 1480, and then 1480 and 1540. The use of the cemetery followed the reconstruction of the church as it was destroyed. It had a round nave, and then it was made more of a rectangular church in the 14th century. And the analyzed skeletal material was generally well preserved, differing from other local contemporary skeletal analysis, such as St. Mary's Spittal. But with such a small sample, it is difficult to form an adequate interpretation of this. The burials proximal to the church took place in the first quarter, 1330 to 1480, were all males, with one possible male, but were all adults. But the later group, dated to 1480 and 1540, differed from the previous phase, and they included females and subadults. Of those 6 burials, there were 2 adult females, a juvenile, an infant, and an in situ fetus were identified. And these all had several health issues, which were identified through the burials, such as rickets, childbirth complications, infections, Schmorl's nodes, and early onset Paget's disease. Given these factors, it's unlikely that they were of any high status, but did have a prominent connection to the Hospitallers following their burials around the church. Clerkenwell did have a cemetery used specifically for lower classes. They did use a pardon churchyard, which was outside their precinct, but this implies benefits for higher status for those buried within the inner precinct. If this were the case, the individuals buried within this may have been those working at the priory. With the rise of Clerkenwell in 1350, this saw the redirection of many funds and many estates coming under their control. Because of this, Clerkenwell received regular visitation from other preceptors in high-ranking order. These visitors are recorded to bring in multiple servants with them. So other prominent preceptors bringing their retinues with them, if they died around this time, then these, along with the people working at Clerkenwell, were likely those buried around the church. So from this small sample, Clerkenwell highlights a diversity of burial, including wealthy Londoners, Carodians, Hospitaller brethren, along with the burials outside, including males, females, and children. Given the status of both Clerkenwell and Slebech, this may shed light on what sort of burials were taking place at Slebech, and further investigation of the Hospitallers has corroborated with this interpretation. There you go, John.
Thank you. So just thinking about the kinds of people that we'd find at Slebech, one thing that's very important to note from the start is that this is not like a monastery. really. They just didn't function in the same way as a monastery or a friary. The numbers of actual brethren probably always extremely small, and in the later Middle Ages almost non-existent. So in 1338, I should also say, as Hugh said, we've submitted this as an article for the Journal of Church Archaeology, and we got our peer review back yesterday. So there are a few things that they were very positive. This is good stuff, they said, so don't worry about that. But there are a few things that we haven't quite had time to fold in, and one of them is about this 1338 report maybe being not quite as crystal as it could be, but nonetheless, there's a 1338 report of the order in England, and it counts 113 hospitaller brethren in residence at 50 houses. So you're barely getting 2 or 3 in a house. Even the chief preceptory of Clerkenwell only housed 7 brothers. So it's nothing really like, even Clerkenwell is like one of the smallest houses of any other actual regular monastic order. In 1338, there were 3 brothers at Clerkenwell, at Slebech. John de Fruick, Knight Preceptor, Simon Launcelin, James de Montgomery. Again, at most monasteries, what you'd expect was there to be local patterns of recruitment. So you get lots of local names, which also means you have local families tied in through younger sons, things like that. Fruick is in Essex, Launcelin's in Hampshire. Quite common, actually, for pretty much all of the hospitallers of England to be recruited from south and eastern England, gentry families, and then redistributed around the country. By sort of central authority. This sort of era, it represents one of the latest periods that we would even expect this many hospitallers at the order's houses in England, as they were much more needed in the central priory and roads. By the 15th century, and this is the point made by Helen Nicholson and O'Malley as well, is that communal life in English hospitaller houses, with the exception of the nunnery at Buckland in Somerset, had pretty much disappeared. You just don't see hospitaller brethren at hospitaller houses in any numbers whatsoever, and that these turn into more like, think of a bishop's palace, where the bishop, or in this case the preceptor, who would own several in plurality, would go around with his retinue in turn. So these regional large sort of hospitaller palaces, where you wouldn't really see brethren, which also means that, unlike a monastic cemetery, most of these hospitaller houses, you're not expecting to see much of a monastic burial ground, as you would to the east end of any monastic church. And that, most of them are absentee. The fact that in the church, the church at Slebech, there isn't any sign of there being any hospitaller burials, any much armory or whatsoever, shouldn't necessarily come as a surprise to us. The hospitallers we do know from Slebech, we can almost all of them show that they went elsewhere afterwards and died either overseas or at Clerkenwell. The next slide. Oh no, it is this side. Sorry, it's still this slide. It's still the other side. Sorry. There are people at these, and as Brian was saying, there are these burials of servants, and we know at Clerkenwell, we know at Slebech, sorry, at the time of the 1338 report, there might be 3 professed brethren, but there were a chaplain, there were 4 pensioners, esquire, chamberlain, bailiff, 10 other servants. So even before the near collapse of communal hospital life, the servants and pensioners would outnumber professed brethren by 6 to 1. So if you're thinking about these, the people that would also then, having been in service at the house, expect burial there, as we find in other places and as we find given in hospitaller documents, and that. These are, you might just find this basically staff, pretty much secular staff with a chaplain, and some pensioners. This is the predominant community. Another late element to this community, for which there's only suggestive evidence, but may have been in considerable importance, is a female presence in the collection of buildings on the south bank of the Eastern Claddow in Minweir, just across the site from the main house at Slebech. And a place now known as Sister's House. Now you can just about make it out on that left map, the 1578 map. You've got Slebech to the northwest of the river, and you've got sister houses directly to the southeast, just across there on the southeast. Helen Nicholson undertook a thorough work on these in 2002, based on field work and an overview of some of the documentary evidence. And this is attested as Cistern House in 1546. Helen Nicholson concluded that on examination of the buildings and the surviving site that this may have been a pilgrim's hospice, which also housed female associates of the Order of Hospitallers. We think that Helen Nicholson is correct on that, but not for the same reasons. And I'll just whip through this quite quickly, but in essence, the sisters' house, that ruinous complex, you can see, overgrown complex, that's basically what it looks like now. Helen Nicholson sort of thought that because these have been described as ruinous in 1811, that meant that they'd probably been ruinous since they were cistern houses in the 16th century. But actually there's plenty of local court evidence and things like that these are continually in occupation as a farm from 1755 to 1831 and undergo a lot of destruction, repair, reconstruction, extension, and they're in a very boggy, marshy, wet, wooded area. It's almost impossible to tell what's going on. What they were certainly was a gentry manor house for the Sheriff of Pembrokeshire in the 17th century. So this was actually some kind of grand gentry house where they would have banquets. Also, there's a couple of other references. So this map, this is Christopher Saxton's 1578 map of Pembrokeshire, has the site marked as sister houses. Subsequently, reprintings of maps, versions of this map in Speech Britannia have the spelling as sister houses. And in the early 18th century, late 17th century, it is called indeed sisters' houses or sister houses. So the idea of this being, that's the name of this thing. It is the house of the sisters. What this has as the relevance of this is the phrase sister houses or sister house in 15th, early 16th century England and Wales has very clear connotations. At Peterborough Abbey, there was a sister houses where 7 almswomen prayed who lodged there, prayed for the souls of the founders in the church. At Winchester Cathedral Priory, the Sustrum Spittal, or the Hospitalis Sororum, the Hospital of the Sisters, was a community of female religious in a complex comprising a hall, a chapel, chambers and kitchen. Crowland Abbey in 1440, the bishop there found a house that used to maintain the parents of the monks and the serving folk of the monastery, but recently had been turned into a sister house, where he doesn't say what that is, but it's clear that it is, a different function, but that probably that the former pensioners' dwellings have been turned into a hospital or almshouse for a small community of religious women. And there has been a lot of work done. Luttrell and Nicholson's 2006 book on edited collection on hospitaller women points out that they had this ambiguous and invisible place within the hospitallers, but were definitely there. And that there were fully professed members of the order. There were nuns at Buckland in Somerset. There were lots of consorores, like associates of the order who could be buried in the habit and remembered in their prayers. But between these, there's these female members of the order who owe obedience but were not fully professed and were often called sister or lay sister. And they do appear in documents, but only rarely. But they spend their days in prayer and they have some kind of role in hospitality and care work at the house. And to cut, I'm not, we did quite a lot of bit on this, but I would say that what we came up with, what we thought was that it would make sense in the context of what we know about sister houses elsewhere, and also what we know about the lack of a professed community of male villagers here in the later Middle Ages, that the hospitality and prayer side of things is effectively being administered by a medieval community of lay sisters here, well known enough in the area for their presence to continue to be marked in the name attached to their buildings for a century and a half after they're gone. And that what we might think of as the late medieval hospital or religious presence in the house and in the potential burial record, therefore, may be more likely to have been female than male. And we shouldn't necessarily expect to, the fact that they don't appear in any documentary evidence should not come as a surprise to us, because nothing appears in much documentary evidence for Slebech after 1338, and these are 15th century foundations usually. So we wouldn't really expect to find them in the documentary evidence, but the name evidence and the evidence of the site does seem to indicate that.
All right, so the surviving fabric and descriptions of the Church of Slebech mainly present a picture of the relationship between the Hospitallers and the local gentry families of Pembrokeshire. The known burials at the church indicate the important position the preceptory held in the socio-political landscape of the area and reveal its rootedness in the local power structures. Particularly important in this regard were the adjacent castles of Wiston and Pixton, and to the Cathedral of St. David's to the west. From here, Slebech was a useful bridgehead for the administration of the order's Irish possessions. One of the earliest documented lay burials is representative of this. In 1270, a daily service in Slebech Church was instituted as a chantry for the souls of Richard and Scholastica de Carew, confreres of the hospital and parents of the then Bishop of St. David's. The Carews were major local figures based at Carew Castle, 10 miles to the south. Richard de Carew's burial site was stated to be before the high altar in Slebech Church, a position often granted to founders or major patrons, and points to Richard's important relationship with the preceptory. In the 13th century, the Carews had extensive landed connections in Ireland, and Richard de Carew, who may be the same that's buried at Slebech, was a signatory in the 1258 petition in Dublin and the holder of lands in Bredick in the County Donegal. And Richard and Scholastica's chantry was arranged by their son, the Bishop of St. David's. Back to you, John.
Yeah, and this so that relationship between local gentry and noble families, also with land holdings in Ireland, is carried through with the two castles that Brian mentioned, much closer to Slebech, Wiston and Picton, which were held by the Wogan family, and there's so many branches of the Wogan family, but two of them hold these castles from the late 13th century, and they maintain that link to Ireland. So you have the Sheriff of Pembrokeshire. The Wogans are often close service of the Earl of Pembroke as well, and they are often serving as justiciars of Ireland. So you've got the continued service of these local family Wogans at castles that are less than 5 miles from Slebech, and are giving Slebech their patronage, linking them to the Earls of Pembroke, and who has the chief interest in both South West Wales and in Ireland, and thus giving the hospital a direct link to the most important landowners and administrators in the region. And these long-term cross-channel connections by local families who are offering patronage to the hospital aids the order in the sort of joint administration of their Welsh and Irish lands. And so the Carews are an early forerunner of that. We know about the Wogans from one of the surviving effigies, which we don't have a picture of, but it stood in Henry Wogan of Wiston, who died in 1475. His wife Margaret formerly stood in Slebech Church. It's now in storage at Scolton Manor Museum, after having been the Museum of Rural Pembrokeshire Life, I believe, having been bussed around a little bit. But he, very important Deputy Justiciar of South Wales, served in the household of the Duke of Gloucester. The tomb stood under a canopied recess in the south wall of Slebech Church, and so it's obviously a very important gentry tomb that highlighting that patronage. In 1590, a local antiquarian described the stained glass of the north window as having a dedication, that's it, to that Henry Wogan's son and his wife, who died in 1486. And following at the end of the Wogan line, the Barlow family came in, the baronets of Slebech. The Barlow family came in, and there's a massive church renovation by the sounds of it in the early 16th century, as the armourist Griffith Shredog talks about armed windows, including the arms of Robert Ure, who was the preceptor in 1513, of the Bryans of Walwyn's Castle and Lough Erne, and of the Barlows of Slebech. So these are major landholding families in the area who are clearly patronising Slebech Church and are being buried there as well. Oh, it's me again, isn't it? So having examined the probable makeup of the late medieval community at Slebech, we think about the sort of more nebulous matter of the other lay burials. We talked about the parishioners, but what about the more itinerant ones, such as pilgrims and travellers, those who are in some way members of the confraternity, and also excommunicants and felons, and this is what the last bit will be about. Since its foundation, the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem had protected and offered hospitality to pilgrims. And this continued throughout the medieval period for travellers, those on pilgrimage, whether abroad or domestic. The obligation was expected by and from the Hospitallers, but without such definite rules as the Benedictines had for providing hospitality. They had to provide it. The Benedictines have very strict rules about how you provide it. The Hospitallers may have owned small properties in Wales specifically for travellers and pilgrims, such as Ysbyty Symphon near Strata Florida, but very difficult to identify whether they did have this. One of the things about the studies of pilgrimage is that if you start looking for pilgrimage, you can find it everywhere, but you can't ever really prove that it happened. If you want to see pilgrims, you can see pilgrims wherever you want. The commandery at Slebech, however, was just off the main southern road to St David's for anyone coming from South Wales, from Swansea, Cardiff, and was 20 miles or a day's journey from the Preceptory to St David's Cathedral. On major occasions of pilgrimage or cathedral visiting, Easter, Pentecost, Michaelmas, St David's Day, it would be reasonable to expect the Preceptory to house significant numbers of travellers on their way to St David's. And in that light, we're thinking about Richard de Carew, the father of the Bishop of St David's. So the Bishop Richard Carew, who buried in Slebech, was the father of the Bishop of St David's, who renovated the shrine and cult of St David. So there's a link between the actual creation and renovation of St David's cult and Slebech as well. And the route and the maintenance of the hospital will be an important and perhaps final staging point. 20 miles is about a day's journey for a medieval pilgrim. One of the chief pieces of evidence for Slebech's pilgrimage role, which has been discussed by historians before, is a late 15th century poem which has traditionally been attributed to Lewis Glyn Cothi. It can't be Lewis Glyn Cothi because people he mentions have roles in it after Lewis Glyn Cothi died. It doesn't match up. So it's just someone doing a Lewis Glyn Cothi style poem. But it's mentioned in almost all historical accounts of Slebech, modern historians' accounts of Slebech, or almost always with little interrogation of the actual source and what's going on, because it has this bit at the start which makes this explicit link between Slebech and pilgrimage, very beguiling, with the surrounding castles of its patrons. Slebech is like Bardsey. Now, Bardsey Abbey, possibly the most famous and important pilgrimage destination in Wales. Most abundant path below the heavens, many indulgences, purifying men are there in abundance in honour of St John of Jerusalem. And then there is in Picton Castle, next door to it, indulgence for the world and plenty of wine too. And this is a satirical poem talking about how the lords at Picton can give you wine and good meat, whereas all that the hospital can really give you is food for the soul, and comparing which is better or worse, effectively. And there you go. And you get these indulgences in wine. Sometimes people say there's a miracle working altar based on this poem. That's unfortunately comes from a very inaccurate earlier translation from 1947. It doesn't say anything of the sort. There's no miracle working altar mentioned in this poem. And the poem was addressed to Thomas Phillips, the Lord of Picton at the time. Yes, which is so it's linking in not only the pilgrimage nature of Slebech with its indulgences, but also on the route to St David, but also linking him in with the kind of hospitality you would expect in this region from the Picton and Wogan lords.
So there are examples of pilgrim burial at hospitaller properties, which have been discovered across continental Europe specifically. One of the largest and most extensive excavations out of a hospital or cemetery happened in Toulouse, revealed many pilgrims' tombs specifically with firm evidence of specific pilgrim identities. So they weren't just looking for pilgrims, they were actually there in this one instance. Yet Toulouse itself was a major pilgrimage destination and a major city, and so a point at which citizen pilgrims would start and end their journeys. Even if Slebech was a major pilgrimage destination within the wider landscape of Southwest Wales, as well as an important stopping off point on the way to and from St. David's, Pilgrims would be likely only ever passing through. There was no reason to expect a resident community of pilgrims or ex-pilgrims at the site, nor substantial numbers of pilgrim burials beyond those who might have had the fortune or misfortune to die whilst at or near Slebech. Further difficulty in this matter comes with any attempt is made to separate out pilgrims, like John said, thoroughly vague category to begin with other travelers passing to and fro from Slebech. And of course, one piece of evidence again from this 1338 report refers to those coming from all over Wales, of which so many come day after day. They are great wasters, and they are very burdensome. And of course, this was at first interpreted to be pilgrims, but it might just be, well, everybody else too. Certainly the amount of bread being provided, 80 quarters per year, 110 loaves per day, points to a vast number of guests, which listed community and staff totaled only of 21 people. The amount of beer was also similarly abundant, calculated at around 70 gallons or 560 pints per day. While these are rough figures, the amounts of beer and bread do tally. For each loaf, there would be almost exactly 5 pints, not unreasonable figure in terms of standard monastic hospitality. Yet, were there really something like 60 pilgrims every single day coming through Slebech? Over 20,000 per year, a figure representing it's around 7% of the entire population of Wales. It's a bit far-fetched there. While pilgrimage has enjoyed something of a renaissance in the last few decades, this has tended to eclipse more mundane local monastic lay relationships at houses such as Slebech. Not only was the house just off the main route across South Wales, but it also was keyed into the network of local noble and knightly power structures, as we just discussed, branched across to Ireland. While pilgrims may have made most of Slebech's hospitality, far more rapacious and consuming would be the knightly retinues, hospitallers and patrons from the order, or other travelers and merchants stopping off on their way to St. David's in Ireland. We should not rule out the invisible presence of many others at the house, such as families of servants, lesser Corodians and pensioners, and a community of female donations. There we go. Back to you, John.
So another group worth considering is, and we've said this name a few times, the widespread community of confraters or confraternity. Papal permission was given to the martial orders to create cemeteries alongside their chapels for the burial of their brethren, but that it was later expanded to anyone who contributed to the order, including lower classes such as villeins, felons, or the excommunicated. These could all be part of the confraternity. The Welsh Hospitallers seem to have had particularly wide-ranging benefits bestowed upon them from the start by the Earls of Pembroke and the Welsh princes, which were confirmed by the English crown in the late 13th and early 14th century. Contained within these were a category of low-status confrater known as expedores, and these were laity who were quit from all services and other works due to the principal lords. If there were villeins, they could sign with the sign of this badge here, the hospitaller badge is a sign. If they were licensed, they could go out of the lands of their lords. They could make their children hospitaller confraters and consorores by giving them this sign without the license of their lords, in return for various dues, the monetary and death dues as well. A third of the individual's property on their death would go to the order, plus various other rents and things. So these are, and in another version of the concession, it says the expedores are those marked with the badge of the hospital. And this seems to be a very wide-ranging thing that people could take up. They could hand down to their children. It gave them special privileges. It allowed them to move around for whatever reason we might think. We'll speculate on that. But the expedores were confraters of the hospital who lived within Wales, but often outside the hospitaller's own lands. Rees said the word expedores might have been a Latinization of the Welsh for hospitaller, is bitiwr. Expedore, it sort of goes in the Latinization of that. But also the Latin definition of the free expedores must have some relevance. This badge of the order, this is a badge of multi-style cross, found in Berkshire. This one, in this light, and as well as other similar statements about confraters wearing a sign of the order of their clothes on the Welsh marches around Shropshire, might be worth considering. In the Small Find Index, this badge was called a pilgrim badge of St. Anthony, I think. but it's much more likely to be a confraternity badge, which will be much more common. Worth thinking about that when, not all pilgrimage.
A statement that these expedores were able to leave their land of their lords, as well as induct their children in the order without permission of their lords, points to potentially mobile contingent of Welsh society, which would naturally be centered around the chief preceptory of Slebech. It is unlikely that the burial at the main house would be part of this package for them, except of course for the tenants living in the manor of Slebech, for whom the church was also their parish church. Instead of confraters and expedores would expect to be buried in their own parish churches, albeit with the mark of the hospitallers and perhaps with the presence of a local hospitaller chaplain or other confraters or expedores present. A major factor in the low numbers of burials within hospitaller cemeteries is that many, if not most, hospitaller burials took place elsewhere. Contextual evidence indicates that a hospitaller burial or a funeral was overseen by a chaplain, or more rarely a professed brother, may not have been necessitated the use of hospitaller cemeteries, but took place either at the parish churches appropriated by the order or the parish church of the deceased. Instructive in this regard is a late 15th century appeal known as the Rhodes Appeal, issued by the hospitallers and publicly read by their agents in parish churches prior to Mass in order to attract laity as confraternity. In exchange for donations and the sale of confrater status, privileges were bestowed upon confraters, including burials overseen by the hospitallers. Within the Rhodes Appeal, the privilege of burial is expressively flexible, able to take place within any Christian cemetery. These appeals signify the hospitallers' active role in the mortuary landscape as they advertised and sold their funerary service in exchange for donations and membership, inclusive of a wide variety of social classes. Of particular interest, the hospitallers were known for burying executed felons, which is kind of strange. Records of court cases of disputes between martial order and local clergy involved hospitaller agents cutting down hanged criminals. In a lot of cases, a few cases, sometimes too soon, causing revival or escape and having to recapture these people. However, out of the multitude recorded cases of hospitaller agents collecting and burying executed felons, only 2 record the deceased were actually registered confrater, and another woman potentially a consorcer. However, the burial of individuals not clearly stated to have confraternity seems to become more prominent within and after the 14th century, suggesting that the hospitallers' burial privileges may have expanded without any sort of written records. Appeals such as the Rhodes Appeal highlighted the recruitment tactic of the hospitallers from the 15th to 16th centuries, which may have attracted numbers of confraters with a far lower level of formal attachment to the order. However, as with the bulk of the confraters, these felons and other lower classes were not buried within hospitaller churchyards or properties. Instead, they were sourced out through other local churches. In many cases, these were very poor churches, indicating an acknowledgement of the deceased's social status. For example, in 1276, thieves were hanged in the town of Ilchester, and hospitaller agents claimed the bodies and buried them within St. Olave's of the same town, which was known to be a very poor church. Although there is no clear evidence from Wales, the presence of the expedores who might leave their lord's lands on the business of the order, the hospitallers did have a network of agents and church sites which might be pressed into the service of burying felons. By using not only the known burial record, but also the potential burial record as a lens through which to consider the social situation of the late medieval Preceptory of Slebech, the slim available evidence can be interrogated in new and focused ways. The particular circumstances of the Preceptory, wherein its chapel was also the parish church of its capital manor of Slebech, the vast majority of burials would have been its immediate local manorial tenants, who were themselves automatically confraters of the house. In terms of the resident community of the house from the 14th century, it is most likely to be comprised of staff of administrators and servants, a handful of pensioners and Herodians, and a group of female donates or consorcers. The continued patronage of the important local knightly and gentry families is shown in the surviving funerary monuments and documentary sources for burial and memorialization in the Preceptory Church through to the early 16th century. More widely, the issue of pilgrimage is still a vexed one. And while there may have been more who passed through the Preceptory, it seems unlikely we would expect to find a significant number of burials of pilgrims. Indeed, pilgrim signs and badges relating to hospitallers may be misrepresentations of expedores and confraternity badges, a group which has been significant presence with ties in the house in the later Middle Ages. Finally, tying these together, the role of expeditores themselves have included being present at the funerals of their fellow confraters, or indeed of treating the bodies of felonious confraters to the appropriate burial, albeit at the chapels and churches of the order throughout Wales, and almost certainly not at the preceptory site. Overall, this analysis of Slebech has laid the groundwork for future work, for further work going on, revealing hospital or mortuary networks, the fluidity of movement with expeditores, and the unique socio-political roles of the hospitallers within medieval Wales. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, both Brian and John. Just a reminder, if you have a question, pop it into the chat box and we can put that to them. I'll just kick off with, well, it's not really, well, it is a question. I was really fascinated by your presentation, the strands of evidence you put together, and the fact you're going to take this research forward. I was wondering whether that would include actually any archaeological field work as well.
I would love to. I have talked about this for quite a bit, and I've been, and I know Ruth's in here. I'm like, we should do this. We are going to go down to Slebech hopefully this summer and talk to a few people, set up some things. And honestly, the fact where they're obviously burials at Slebech and they have had no excavation or anything. I would love to make friends with the people that own that hotel and see what happens. But also, yes, I feel like even in the wider scheme of things of hospitallers and Templars and the cemeteries, a lot of the excavations took place early. And I feel like if we could reanalyze that and have a look, there is some things to really find out about this. So I think there's a lot more potential, specifically with field work, when it goes to understanding the mortuary landscapes of just military orders in general in Europe. So, and specifically Slebech. So,
and just one of the things actually we're doing from this is to, if we were to what we were saying at the start, if we were to excavate the church graveyard, where do we think it would be and how big do we think it is? That is effectively the question of, like, you've got to have that fairly, LiDAR might be able to do something, but you've got to have that idea in your head of like where you expect, or what you would expect to find before you go in. Obviously underneath the church, who knows? In the church itself, because we know that there were burials there, and we've got no idea how extensively it was mined in 1840. But yeah, I think there's definite scope for well, and on the other side as well at Cistern House, very complex site. Yeah.
Fascinating. We'll get you back once you've got your trowel out. And all right, anyway, sorry, Rob, have we got other questions in the chat box?
Yeah, we've got a few questions. So yeah, John and Brian, pick these up, whoever wants to answer these. Two questions from David. One is, would many of the sisters have been like the Beguines on the continent?
Well, it's a difficult question as to what you've got. The Beguines tend to be a little bit more towards the sort of anchoress side of things. Yes, they are living in communities, but it's not, it's a bit more mystic. Whereas this, we're looking at really lay sisters, I think, or widows who want to take on, you'd always get the Martha and the Mary thing. And the thing is, we just don't really know much about any of these communities beyond their existence. Even at places like Winchester, not that well understood. But they do seem to come up in the early 15th century, which, I mean, 150 years after we're looking at the Beguines. They do seem to have this sort of attachment to major monasteries, which again you don't really get with the Beguines, which are a bit more independent. So they are serving this function. It is more a sort of active type of nunnery, I think, but again, it's hard to say necessarily in a lot of these cases, just because the evidence is so poor. But yeah, it's not directly analogous to the Beguines, because they tend to be sort of living these individual lives, and also they get pretty much stamped out by about 1500, so above 1400. So yeah, it's not But it is a type of female devotional communal life. So in that sense.
Good. Yeah, great. Thank you, David. I hope that answers your question. David also has a second question. He says, were the knights preceptor and the sergeants ever ordained, or was a chaplain employed to provide the spiritual support?
Both in certain cases. And if John, to jump in here if you want to, but some of the evidence shows that depending on who was dying, really, for at least funerals, I know that a lot of the different brethren would show up to funerals of other brethren or of other upper class, upper status individuals. But what it seems like, if there's these burials of low status confrater or even expedores or even villains or felons, it seems to be an agent that sort of like a chaplain would go, or someone else is sort of outsourced or hired to do so. So it seemed like it was determined by the social class of the individual, at least on the funerary standpoint, because that's where it stood by. So, John, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Oh, in terms of general ordination of them, you do get knight chaplains earlier on, and you do get the idea that the sergeants and preceptors would be ordained early on. This, I believe, changes as the Middle Ages wear on. Knight chaplains tend to cease to be a thing in England. This there are differences depending on which lang you're in, which area, which region of Europe, where hospitals operate slightly differently. But so rather than then the knight sergeants might not be ordained, or might not be ordained till they go to Rhodes, and they're just outsourcing pretty much everything to stipendiary chaplains. You don't, I mean, which is, you sort of see that in monasticism as well, apart from the in more regular monasticism, apart from their desire to say mass every day. But yeah, I don't think the sergeants are necessarily ordained on the reg, as it were, in the later Middle Ages, but the preceptor would, I think, be expected to be ordained. But yeah, and again, all of this happens in Rhodes, and yeah, that's which I've just seen one of the other questions pop out, and I think Rhodes is going to come up again soon.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Were there this is Michelle who has a question. Were there any important relics housed in the Slebech church?
That altar popped up on having healing qualities. That's really all that I've seen.
Yeah, and that's a mistranslation.
Yeah,
it's not. That's, I think that's actually talking about the table of the Lord in Picton Castle as a sort of bit of a joke. And that it has healing qualities. It's got so much wine on it. But I mean, all of that, of course, is very clever little, little references to the altar, but it doesn't quite say it like that. I mean, most churches would have some relics. Yeah, it's just whether they're famous or not.
There is that one evidence that we were kind of had some issues with in the beginning, because I think it was the 16th century they found a sword. And there was two different writings of this, where they said they found it in a mound, which made it seem very interesting. But then it seemed to be it was stored in the hall of Slebech, which not a relic, but it was a piece of medieval interest, I would say, that kind of put us down some rabbit holes for a little bit of time. But it seemed to be just a piece from the order that they kept there. But the writings about it made it seem a bit more special and mystical in a way.
I mean, also just as a general point, it is very rare that any church, even major churches, actually have lists of what their relics are surviving. It's just something you get. It's so sporadic if you get that sort of thing. We know about some relics from tiny little bridge chapels. They know their full relic collection just because it happens to survive on the doors of an accounting roll or something. And then we've got major churches and monasteries and things we have absolutely no idea what they had. So yes, it's just one of those things where it's a complete lottery. And in this case, we just don't know whether they had a relic. I mean, you'd expect them to have a relic of St. David. You'd expect them to have a relic of St. John. I don't think, well, they wouldn't. We just have no evidence to say that they would. Did rather.
Interesting. Thank you. Right. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So we'll go with Hillary's question, which is there any central source of records for Hospitaller landholding in the later medieval period?
Yes, it's in Rhodes.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
It's in Rhodes and it's not tremendously accessible.
Yeah.
Although there is a good book by, I think, Eugene O'Malley.
Mm.
Yeah, on the Knights Hospitaller in the English Lang in the 15th and early 16th century, which draws on a lot of those records, and came out from a doctoral thesis. But that's a really good book on the land holdings from those records in England and Wales and Ireland. So yeah, if you wanted to if you were interested in that, that's the book to look at. Knights Hospitallers in the English Lang by Eugene O'Malley. But yeah, there's a cache in Rhodes, but I'm not entirely clear. There are also, I mean, there's Clerkenwell Cartulary, a volume of that survives for Essex and has been published. The bits and bobs for Slebech are spread over a couple of different archives, much harder to really get at. But most of it was centralized anyway, because they don't work so much as individual houses as they work as a sort of top-down network, but everything goes up to the middle, a bit more like the Cluny Acts, but even more so.
That's great. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, Hugh. I think I'll hand back to you now. That's all the questions.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. I would, just before I thank my speakers and let you all go, I'm just going to make two very quick announcements. The first is that we have another talk coming up next month on the 5th of April, and we're going to be carrying on the theme a little bit here, as we have Dr. Kevin Coots, who's going to be talking about a medieval burial ground at Poulton. So do make sure you keep an eye out for that. The only other thing I'm going to say is just that it's a general comment, or general sort of putting it out there. The society is still lacking a treasurer, and we are very keen to recruit a new treasurer to come and join our committee. So if anyone who's in this talk feels that they might have the expertise or would like to sort of get involved in our committee, do let us know. Either drop me a line or drop the general society email and address. I can safely say our accounts are extremely simple, so it isn't that big or odorous task. So I just thought I'd put that out there. But otherwise, I would like to thank both Brian and John for a fascinating talk and for mastering the technology without a single hitch. And I'd like to thank you all for attending, and I hope we will see you again soon. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Appreciate that.
Yes, thank you. Been good fun.